All right, I think we have 24, 25 people, attendees now, and then more coming. So I would like to start this session. So this is the second part of the session entitled New Insights on Structure, where we would like to invite 3 speakers today for this session to introduce recent research outcomes from their seismic experiments targeting the formation and evolution of ocean basins, mantle imaging, rifted margins, and subduction zones. This session is recorded and then will be posted later. So if you missed part 1 session, the video is going to be there. So I would like to suggest you to visit that later on. And then also, when you have questions to speakers, feel free to type up those in the chat box, or you can wait until the Q&A session after the talk. So the first speaker is Dr. Harm van Avendonk from University of Texas Institute for Geophysics. Harm, are you ready? When you're ready, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Masako. Can you all see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay, let me try that again.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Yep.
Yeah, we can see it now. That's great.
Yes, thank you. So thanks again for organizing this session. I would also like to recognize some collaborators that I've had over the year that fit with this theme, that I've worked on these kind of topics. Brandon Schuck, my student, and Gail Christensen, to Eddie and Bissell. What I'm going to talk about is what evidence we have for the initiation of continental rifts from seismic refraction data mainly. And I want to focus on 2 very old continental rift margins, one on the east coast of North America, actually the east coast of the United States, and also in the Gulf of Mexico. So these are 2 margins that are relatively close to each other in a somewhat similar regional setting, but also perhaps with somewhat different geodynamic driving forces. And these are things that we can investigate with new seismic data. So first about continental rifting. I mean, we recognize that a lot of continental rifts develop along sutures and old fault lines. This is a region then where there's a local weakness, and if there's a large far distance driving force, then the fault can initiate, and if the tensile stress is stronger than the strength of the lithosphere, then continental rifting may actually proceed. This can be facilitated also, for example, by serpentinization of the strong upper mantle. But a mechanism that's much stronger, much more effective in reducing the weakness of the lithosphere is introducing melts, for example, by magmatic diking. This is something that Roger Buck showed in a paper in 2004. So if we can find evidence at ancient rift margins for the presence of melt, past presence of melt, for example, either due to intrusive magmatism or extrusive volcanism, then that gives us an indication that about the driving mechanism for rifting. It also may then address whether or not, for example, far field stresses or local instabilities really caused the initiation of the rift. So at the bottom here of this slide, I'm showing a cartoon style figure from a paper by Dieter Franke. And he showed 2 kind of type example of rift margins. One is so-called non-volcanic margin, where the crust tapers, the continental crust tapers towards the margin, and large faults develop that are eventually then leading to the separation of continental crust, the exhalation of mantle rock to the surface, which then can lead to serpentinization, and eventually the formation of thin oceanic crust. The other kind of end member model is a volcanic margin, these are more characterized then by large volcanic flows. And they can be imaged with, especially with seismic reflection data, because they show as seaward dipping reflections. You can also see a relatively thick igneous crust at the continent-ocean transition. And usually these are then melts that are half formed at a large depth in the mantle under high temperatures. And they produce relatively mafic melts, as we'll see, that it can also then be imaged by high seismic velocities. And so typically the oceanic crust that lies seaward of these volcanic margins is also a little bit thicker than at non-volcanic margins, and maybe even thicker than typical for the modern mid-ocean ridge system. So the first study that I'm going to talk about is regarding the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico was long not really understood, like where it really fits in terms of rift and margins. There were a lot of people that were arguing that's not really a pair of rift and margins. It's like we don't really know. Perhaps the sediment input was always large. Maybe there was something unusual about it. Maybe it didn't really form real oceanic crust. It's actually relatively recent in the last 10 years that we know that that's not true. For example, in gravity data, it was published by Dave Samuel just really less than 10 years ago. It shows an extinct mid-ocean ridge system in the central Gulf of Mexico, here shown in blue in this figure. And it's offset by a lot of transform faults. And this mid-ocean ridge system was really active for only about 25 million years between kind of the late Jurassic to early Cretaceous. The kind of the transition from that oceanic crust to the continental crust, or to the north and to the south, is not very well known. I mean, we now know a little bit more from seismic data that I'll show. And so we're still trying to understand exactly then the extent of oceanic crust, which is important also for plate tectonic reconstructions. It's really a difficult place to do seismic imaging because of the Cenozoic sediment influx from the interior North America that has really covered up a lot of the synrift strata. But of course, seismic imaging can help resolve that. So here you see a little bit more then about that geodynamic setting. Here I'm showing again in bright colors, you see the mid-ocean ridge system from red, which is the kind of the early Cretaceous oceanic crust, to darker blue, the oldest oceanic crust from the Jurassic. But that's a relatively small slice, and what you see in all the pinkish colors is all stretched continental crust as we know it now. So this is an ocean basin that formed while the Atlantic was opening. Here on the right upper corner in light blue, you see that the Atlantic ridge system was already well underway. And it's not really known whether there was any kind of hotspot influence. There's also been suggested here that this was a back arc basin, but that is also somewhat unusual in the sense that in the Pacific realm, there was a subduction zone, but it was at the right angles with this mid-ocean ridge system. So in order to address this, in 2010 at the University of Texas in Austin, we obtained industry funding to gather data. And I'm just showing here 4 profiles in the northern Gulf of Mexico to help address like whether these are non-volcanic or volcanic rift margins, and then try to understand what the geodynamic setting was. And so this was then also the foundation of the very large salt basin that was deposited later. So we gathered data with a ship of opportunity, the so-called Iron Cat, which we used to deploy ocean bottom seismometers for component short period instruments that we spaced on the order of 12 kilometers apart. Then we shot data on these refraction lines that I'm showing here in the upper panel. And then we picked up the instruments. We were relatively successful. We lost relatively few instruments. The data quality is very high where there is no salt. Salt is a very difficult place in a salt basin is a very difficult place to gather seismic data otherwise. But I think that the project was ultimately very successful. So here's just an example of the seismic refraction data. You see distance on the horizontal axis. So these are data where we have seismic data refracted, recorded over distances more than 100 kilometers. At near offsets, here in green, we see waves that are turning into sediments. In orange, you see waves that are bouncing off the top of the acoustic basement. In dark red, we have the seismic refractions occurring in the crust. We have in bright red the mantle, the moho reflections, and we even have a little bit of mantle refractions as well. So if we can correlate these kind of arrivals and these events, we can interpret them and correlate them across different instrument records on a seismic line, then we can use them in some kind of combined tomographic inversion scheme. So this is the result of that. What you're seeing here in the bottom panel is a seismic velocity model, where the orange reddish colors is our crustal structure. In green, we have the sediments. And in the upper panel, you're seeing the travel times that were picked in the refraction data as a solid line, and the dashed lines are the calculated travel times. So in a tomographic scheme, we're adjusting both the seismic velocities and the depth of these reflecting boundaries to get the best data fit, and also at the same time the smoothest model that is fitting these data. What we found when we apply this to the data in the Gulf of Mexico, then we found that the crust is relatively low in seismic velocity and on the order of 15 kilometers thick near the coastline. It tapers then to something more like 6 kilometers in the central Gulf of Mexico. And there's a lot of variability in the seismic velocity structure, ranging from 5.5 kilometers per second to 7.5 kilometers per second. That is a very wide range. We think that probably means that there is both continental crust that is stretched and new igneous crust. It also appears that the high velocity regions in the crust, especially on GUMBO line 1 offshore Texas, the high seismic velocities in the crust, they correlate with positive anomalies in the magnetic data. This indicates indeed then that these are volcanic constructs. But at the same time, we also think that there's stretched continental crust here as well. So this is something that is more or less a non-volcanic margin, but with some volcanics inputs as well. This is very different from the crustal structure that we have in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico, where the seismic velocities are very smooth. We have very thick crust, for very thick igneous crust near, for example, the Alabama coastline. That's on the order of 27 kilometers thick. Seismic velocities are uniformly high, more than 7, maybe even 7.5 kilometers per second. In the shallow structure, we see seaward dipping reflections, which we think are these kind of lava flows. So this is a classic example of a volcanic rift and margin. This was quite a surprise that we have such a difference in structure, and we attribute that to a difference in lithospheric structure in the southern United States, where we have more cratonic lithosphere in the west and more transitional accreted continental crust in the east, which allows for maybe more shallow mantle upwelling in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. This is something I just want to take with us when I move to the next data project that I want to show. That is a so-called ENAM project of Virginia and North Carolina. Here we had a 2-ship experiment with the Marcus Langseth and the Endeavor. And that was to gather both active source seismic data on land, offshore. There were also broadband seismic data recorded through Earthscope on land and in the ocean with ocean bottom seismometer data offshore. So this is a fantastic nested seismic data set to investigate all kinds of sediment and deep crustal processes offshore Virginia and North Carolina. What's interesting about this place is that rifting already started in the Triassic, even before, for example, the Gulf of Mexico or any other basin opened. So this is the first breakup of Pangaea. Then at 201 million years ago, there was a large magmatic event, so-called Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or CAMP. And after that, the rifting really started speeding up. But we don't really know exactly the relationship between this magmatic event and the offshore rifting. So what's interesting about the magnetic anomalies in this area is that there is a large magnetic anomaly on the coast, ECMA. This is very common along all rifted margins. But if you go just a good 200 kilometers farther offshore, there's a second magnetic anomaly, the so-called Lake Spur magnetic anomaly, or BSMA. And we don't really know what the dynamic role is of that feature. And it's particularly surprising because the eastern coast of the United States is conjugate to Northwest Africa. If you do a reconstruction, there is obviously a conjugate to the East Coast magnetic anomaly in West Africa, but it's not really a conjugate to the so-called Blake spur magnetic anomaly. And so it appears then that the whole region between the East Coast magnetic anomaly and the Blake spur magnetic anomaly is probably somehow related to rifting. It's an asymmetric feature in the sense that it doesn't exist offshore Africa, but we don't really know yet what its role in rifting is. So this was one of the targets then of this community seismic experiment in 2015. So we gathered data both across the entire margin, but also along the East Coast magnetic anomaly and the Blake spur magnetic anomaly. To thank again all the people that were involved in this fantastic data acquisition project. This is really a fantastic data set with unusually good seismic reflection and refraction data, especially in deep water, and also great broadband seismic data in a rift and margin setting. So here you see in more close-up the seismic refraction data, where short period instruments are shown as orange triangles, and these red lines are the seismic refraction. So we'll be showing data from these two lines crossing the margin, and also a line parallel to the Blake spur magnetic anomaly. So besides the seismic refraction data, we also have great seismic reflection data shown here. This was processed by Anne Bissell, where we see very clearly the top of the basement. We see a little bit of the moho. And so when we make these kind of seismic refraction models, we also always try to make them consistent with the seismic reflection constraints, whether that's either in two-way travel time or in depth. Here you see an example of the ocean bottom seismometer data. I mean, this is really very high quality. The distances are very large. I mean, these are hundreds of kilometers over which we see crustal refractions, moho reflections, and then very fast mantle seismic refractions as well. So all these kind of phases we again use in a reflection refraction tomography scheme. Here you see two lines crossing the margin from just north and south of Cape Hatteras, offshore Virginia and North Carolina. And so these seismic velocity models are eerily similar to what we saw earlier of Alabama. So we have in both cases, we have this kind of accreted continental crust, Paleozoic crust, more or less Appalachian crust. And what we're seeing here is that the seismic velocity structure is similar in that we have on the order of 27 kilometers thick crust near the coastline with velocities higher than 7, maybe 7.5 kilometers per second in the lower crust. But then offshore, it is something very different. And that is that the crust is relatively thin between the so-called East Coast magnetic anomaly and the Blake spur magnetic anomaly. It's only 6 kilometers thick. And the velocities are higher than what we see in normal oceanic crust. They're on the order of 7.5 kilometers per second. And it's only when we go seaward of the Blake spur magnetic anomaly that we have higher velocities. And these higher velocities are somewhat consistent with the thickness here of the crust. So what we're really seeing seaward of the Blake spur magnetic anomaly is what we think is normal oceanic crust with relatively high temperatures. But it's not immediately obvious how we can get such thin crust with high velocities in between these two magnetic anomalies. These seismic velocity models, again, are consistent with the seismic reflection data. You see another study by Anne Bissell that was published in JGR last year. And so what she showed in her work also is that the basement, the top of the basement in this enigmatic zone is relatively rough, and that we have smooth seafloor seaward of the Blake spur magnetic anomaly. So the area where we have relatively thin crust with high velocities also has a rough basement. So the way that we can possibly explain this is with the petrological model. So what we can do is our student Brandon Schuck has used so-called P-melts to take any kind of mantle composition and a mantle potential temperature, and then model the melting process, what kind of melts are derived at different depths, and what kind of phases are crystallizing in the crust. That is the question, and we can use different starting compositions, but especially vary the mantle potential temperature and also the thickness of the lithosphere, where that actually puts a stop to the mantle decompression. So if you have thicker lithosphere, you cannot decompress the mantle at very shallow levels. So what's really important in all this is the precipitation of olivine. If you have high temperatures deep in the mantle where the melts are generated, we have a large component of olivine. If this olivine component shows up in the gabbros in oceanic crust, then its seismic velocities will be higher. So when Brandon modeled this for example, ENAM line 3, what he found is that we have great constraints from both the compressional and shear wave seismic velocities. We can either start with a primitive or a depleted, which is a normal mid-ocean ridge composition. And what we find is that we can model different mantle potential temperatures, shown here in cooler mantle conditions in blue, and higher temperatures in the mantle in red. And if we vary that, we can get different seismic velocities and different crustal thicknesses, meaning that we would expect that if the temperature goes up, that both the seismic velocities are higher and the crust of in the continent ocean transition zone will be thicker. So that's all fine. And what we find that what you're seeing here, the black crosses are the actual data from ENAM. And we see kind of a range of mantle potential temperatures that really fit with the so-called primitive mantle composition, which means that the original mantle beneath Pangaea was not the mantle that we see at present in the mid-ocean ridge system. It was less depleted. But that the temperatures then also are relatively high, on the order of 1400 to 1440 degrees. That is certainly 40, maybe 60 degrees hotter than what we find in the mid-ocean ridge system, but it's not so hot as what we would expect for a mantle plume, where the temperature anomalies could probably easily be 100 degrees. Now, what really makes the area between the East Coast magnetic anomaly and the Blake-Spermik anomaly so unique is that there probably was a relatively thick lithosphere, for example, 15 kilometers thick, that really prevented a lot of melting at shallow depth levels. So even though the seismic velocities were high in this region in the crust, because the mantle melts were mafic, there was still relatively thick lithosphere when Pangaea started to break up in the Central Atlantic Basin. And this is somewhat a surprising result, because as we've seen in an earlier kind of work, for example, from Roger Buck, if we introduce melts in a rift system, it really should reduce the tensile strength, and it should make it possible to have really rapid breakup of the continental lithosphere. But this seems not to have happened in the Central Atlantic Basin. So we still need to learn a lot more about the role of melts in continental breakup. This is also confirmed, this kind of interpretation is also again confirmed by the seismic reflection data, because the really rough basement that we see in this region would also indicate that the lithosphere was strong and relatively thick. So my conclusions are that we can use seismic refraction data to better understand the tectonic setting and the geodynamics of continental rifting, even as far back as in the Jurassic. We find a surprising change in the lateral change in the Gulf of Mexico, where we think that the Western Gulf of Mexico was more cratonic lithosphere that was rifting, and that was so thick that it didn't lead to much magmatism compared to the Eastern Gulf of Mexico. The mantle, the kind of the lithosphere that was rifting in the Eastern Gulf of Mexico seems to be very reminiscent of the Atlantic. The only real difference then with the rifting in the Atlantic was that we have this very enigmatic, relatively thin, high velocity oceanic crust that formed really adjacent to the East Coast magnetic anomaly. And we think that means that the lithosphere was still thick, and it took a long time for the lithosphere to break in the opening of the Central Atlantic Basin. These high seismic velocities can be explained by what we call continental insulation. So the large area of Pangaea really kept the mantle beneath it relatively warm, but this is not the same as a mantle plume. That's what I have for today. These are kind of my conclusions. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ham. We have some questions in the chat. So let me see. First from Beatrice. So how do you explain the large high amplitude magnetic anomaly along the Texas coast?
The question is, how do you explain the magnetic anomaly? This is a really good question. I mean, the large magnetic anomaly along the coast was always considered an indication as that would be the continent ocean transition here. And we still don't really know whether this is a volcanic feature. We do now know that, that there is a relatively thick and low velocity crust beneath it. So even if there was a volcanic outpouring, it is not so that that is igneous crust from top to bottom. I do think that it's so fortuitous that there's a large magnetic anomaly along the coast that I do think that it formed during rifting, but that it's just misleading in the sense that this is not all igneous crust.
Thank you, Harm.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question to Harm? We have a few minutes left for this first talk.
Looks like there's one from Jeff in the chat.
Okay, yep. So from Jeff, we heard no evidence of a large-scale serpentinization as other margins see. Was it really always too hot, or is it possible that some features could be interpreted as large serpentinite bodies?
What we see in the rift and margins, especially in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico and in off the east coast of the United States, is we see very strong moho reflections, and the moho reflections are difficult to explain by serpentinization, in a sense that we do not think that there's some kind of serpentinization front in the lithosphere that will produce those kind of moho reflections. We do think indeed that the temperature of the mantle was a little bit too high for serpentinization to happen.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, if not, thank you so much, Harm, for great talk. It's always great to see your Gulf of Mexico and the ENAM work. So well done.
Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen.
So now we are moving to the second speaker, Dr. Olugboji. Is Tolu here?
No, so we're going to have a quick change in the schedule and go with Ross. Ross has volunteered to
Hi, Ross. Good morning.
next.
Are you ready? Whenever you're ready, please take it away. So Ross Parnell-Turner, Dr. Ross Parnell-Turner is a marine geophysicist at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He's assistant professor there, focusing today on the repeat microearthquake experiment at 13 North Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Thanks, Ross.
Okay, hopefully you can hear and see my screen.
Yep.
Great. Sorry to those of you who are hoping to hear about sediments from Tolu. You'll have to hopefully wait for another half an hour. You've got to listen to me for a little bit instead. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak today. And I'm excited to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing on oceanic core complexes, mostly in the Atlantic Ocean. And this is work that I've been doing along with Rob Sohn, my colleague at Woods Hole, and then also a bunch of colleagues who are in the UK. And you're going to be seeing some data that were collected using instruments operated by the UK OBS facility. And this is work done along with Christine Pierce and Roger Searle and Nuno Simão, who were in Durham, and Tim Reston and Chris McLeod. And by way of introduction, the background image you'll look at here is a perspective view down on this 13 North segment of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. You can see here these main two features that we're going to be talking about for the next few moments, are these two large domes that are located just where my mouse is. Can you guys see my mouse? These two large domes, these are two youthful oceanic core complexes, and I'll tell you what I mean by that in a few moments. And the question we're trying to answer is whether these two corrugated features, these two large-scale faults, are connected in the subsurface or not. So I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about what we know about oceanic detachments to date, and some previous observations, although I'm not going to have time to go into too much background. And then we're going to get on to this vexing question about whether these faults have continuous slip in the subsurface. We're going to spend most of our time looking at this area at 13 North, and I'm going to concentrate on these two OBS experiments. The first one, which happened in 2014, which was a deployment that was intended for passive monitoring of microearthquakes. And then there was this kind of fortunate event that happened in an experiment that happened in 2016, where we got an additional 11 days of passive monitoring as part of an active source experiment. And then finally, if I've got some time at the end, we're just going to take a look at the arguments about whether these detachments are connected or not in the subsurface. I'm also going to show you some evidence for depth-dependent seismicity. And then finally, we're going to have a think about whether these faults undergo some kind of life cycle that we don't really understand just yet. So to start with, for those of you who are not obsessed like me with slow-spreading mid-ocean ridges, we've known since really the mid-1990s that oceanic crust is not simply constructed by this nice Penrose model of sheeted dikes, gabbros, pillar basalts, the kind of thing you might see in an ophiolite section. And instead, in places where we have slow spreading, like in the Atlantic Ocean, we see these large offset dome-like features. So this image here is from a paper by Joe Kahn in the mid-90s. And we're looking again at a perspective view down on this feature called Atlantis Massif, which is this dome-shaped feature just north of the Atlantis transform. And you can see these corrugations on top, like the ones you saw in my first slide. And what we find is that when you take rock samples from these kind of locations, rather than finding the typical pillar basalts that you'd expect, instead we find all these weird and wonderful exotic rock types. For example, these are a couple of hand specimens dredged from the 16 North segment of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, published in this paper by Alessio Sanfilippo. And you can see these kind of bizarre looking dunites and even some very primitive gabbros like troctolites. And we now know that these kinds of deep-seated rocks are commonly found on the seafloor in these kinds of locations. And so these rock types really have no business being on the seafloor if you just have layered oceanic crust. So something else must be going on. And then in the mid-2000s, a student of Rob Soane's, Brian DeMartin and others, conducted a passive seismicity experiment at the TAG Oceanic Detachment System. We're here at around 26 North on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. TAG stands for Transatlantic Geotraverse, whoever came up with that. Anyway, on the map you can see here, the white dots are the location of short period OBSs. These were HUI D2s that were deployed for about 6 months in 2003. There was a fairly small number of instruments, and they were centered around this yellow star that you can see where my mouse is, which is the active TAG hydrothermal vent system. So they were trying to monitor the vents as well as the seismicity. And the little black dots, the dead flies, you can see on this map are the microearthquakes that were detected during that deployment. And they define this really remarkable arcuate shape of seismicity associated with this long-lived detachment fault. Then if we look in cross-section, this panel here shows this profile from A to A prime. To get your eye in, the seafloor is this black line coming through here, and all these little black dots are these microearthquakes that they detected. You can see the microearthquakes define this, this steeply dipping fault surface at depth, which you can interpret however you like, but you can connect it back using a couple of different lines here back to the surface where you have this corrugated fault exposed on the seafloor. There are some oddities with these results. You'll notice, for example, that there are these earthquakes that are sitting in the hanging wall, sorry, in the footwall side of the detachment fault. It's kind of odd. You'll notice that the focal mechanisms that are plotted here, there are only 3 of them, and really this experiment was pretty modest and didn't have a lot of instruments or very large aperture, and you can see that it was pretty challenging to get first motion focal mechanisms, and so we really, from this experiment, really didn't understand the mode of faulting going on in this system. And then lastly, there are other interesting things here, but just in an interest of time, the last interesting thing is you'll notice that there are microearthquakes at depth that nicely define this fault surface. And we know the fault surface is shallowly dipping at the seafloor, but in between there's not much going on at all. And you can see there's almost no microearthquakes in this shallow section in the upper 2 to 3 kilometers. And so there's this unknown question about what's going on in the shallow section, and we'll try and deal with that later on before I sign off this morning. So in terms of understanding these core complexes, there's been quite a lot of work done in the numerical modeling world. So I'm just to give you a flavor for what we know. This is the results of a nice paper by Sam Howell that came out in 2019. And we know that the slip on these faults is probably something to do with the amount of magma supply that is available to that ridge segment. And so if we just look at this panel over here to the far left, we have in this numerical model a fault surface that dips at quite high angles at depth, and it rolls over to shallow dips at the surface, which is what we'd expect. And then by varying the amount of magma supply along axis, in Sam's model, you're able to transition from this detachment mode to a more typical abyssal hill mode of seafloor spreading. And so we can replicate this transition from detachment to non-detachment by varying magma supply. And then that raises the question, well, if you have adjacent oceanic detachment, so if there was another oceanic detachment fault up here to the north, whether you would expect to see those 2 fault surfaces being connected to one another. This also raises the question about how long can you keep slipping on one of these long-lived detachments. So I'll show you in a moment, but we know that they can slip for several millions of years, but we don't know what happens at the end of that life cycle of that detachment fault. And we also don't really know what causes a detachment fault to initiate. And so this is a cartoon that some of you may have seen before, that's kind of adapted from Cesar Ranero's work. And we have this kind of hypothesis that whether these 2 adjacent detachments, which are shown here in purple, whether they're connected by this undulating detachment surface, which you can see shown by my mouse. And we don't know that from what we can observe just using seafloor observations, because this whole area is typically covered up by hanging wall debris or by faulted blocks of basaltic material. So the only way to really understand this is by looking at microearthquakes. So this is the question we're going to try and tackle in the next 15 minutes. And that brings us back to 13 North. And the reason that 13 North is a great place to try and understand this issue is because we have these 2 adjacent detachments or core complexes, which I showed you in my first slide. You can describe them as being relatively mature because they have this long exposure of corrugated seafloor. We think they've been slipping for at least 2 million years. And in between them, you can see there's this tempting axial ridge with a nice circular volcanic construct next to it. So there's clearly something going on in between them. And they've been previously pretty well studied. There's been a series of expeditions to this area, both using autonomous underwater vehicles and remotely operated vehicles, so we know what the rocks look like down there. And there's been extensive dredging by both British, French, and American colleagues. So in 2014, as part of a 2-cruise experiment funded jointly by the UK NERC and the NSF, we deployed 23 short period OBSs mostly over the 1320 detachment. So I should say these 2 detachments are referred to as 1320 due to its latitude, and 1330 detachments. That's what I mean when I say 1320 and 1330. These are OBSs that are operated by the UK pool. They're based on the Scripps short period design. And as you can see from this network, we had an instrument spacing of around 3 to 4 kilometers, and our objective was that we could try and image some of that shallow seismicity. And we placed the network so that we could try and understand both what was going on the 1320 detachment, but also try and see what was happening in between these two detachments. But you can see that given, I guess as a seismologist, you always want more instruments. We didn't have enough instruments to cover the whole area. There was a lot that was left going to be unknown. So during that deployment, we were able to detect and locate with pretty good accuracy over 18,000 microearthquakes. I used a combination of non-linear lock and Felix Walthauser's HyperDD code. These earthquakes are obviously very small, and typically the local magnitudes range from about -1 to just under 3, and we have a magnitude of completion of about 0.3. And if we look in map view, we have this kind of main result, which is that we have these two bands of seismicity adjacent to the 1320 detachment. You can see hints of seismicity here in the north. There's this kind of diffuse cloud of events. But since these events are outside of the network, we don't really have a lot of constraints on their location, and so I wouldn't put too much stock in that pattern up there. But nevertheless, it does seem interesting that in this area where we do have good station coverage, there is very little microearthquake activity to the north of the 1320 detachment. That might lead you to think that something else was going on in between these two detachment faults. So the most interesting result of this experiment, arguably, not only were those two bands, but also the focal mechanisms. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but these two bands have very distinct first motion focal mechanisms. So typically this eastern band shows quite steeply dipping between 60 and 70 degrees normal faulting. And the western band has a much more mixed bag, but there's quite a bit of evidence of compression or reverse faulting in the footwall side. If we look at that in cross section, these panels A and B show cross sections across that catalog. To get your eye in, the seafloor is this solid black line here. The bold portion of this line is the exposure of the corrugated surface at 1320. And if we just concentrate on this panel B for a moment, the events highlighted in blue are those in the west, in the footwall, and those in red are in the hanging wall. And I've plotted some focal mechanisms here. These are now in cross section, so we don't have strike slip faulting here. These are normal faulting events just plotted in cross section. And you can see that those events in the in the east clearly define this steeply dipping fault surface. And you can imagine that would connect up with this corrugated fault exposure on the seafloor. And the events to the west, these compressional events clearly sit inside that hanging wall, and so they're unlikely to be on the fault surface itself. And that led us to this idea that in the steeply dipping deeper portion, we just have a typical normal fault, which is what you saw at tag. And in the hanging wall, we have this, in the footwall, we have this evidence for compression, which might be as a result of bending stresses in that deforming plate as it rolls over to shallow angles. So the bit that I'm most excited to tell you about is this 2016 experiment. So we came back to the same area in 2016 as part of this three cruise plan. And our objective was to collect wide angle reflection and refraction seismic data. So this is our airgun array towed from the back of the British research ship, the James Cook. You can see the weather was very nice. And here's an OBS deployment. And we deployed 57 short period, actually there were some broadbands in there, but mostly short period instruments. And you can see the network layout over here on the map. And you can see that the distribution of instruments was much more comprehensive than what you saw in 2014. And I guess with my passive seismology hat on, I was very excited that there were nearly 11 days when my colleagues weren't firing off their pesky air guns with the OBSs on the seafloor, which meant there was this opportunity to repeat our microearthquake observations. The results of the seismic refraction work are published by my colleague Nuno Simão's paper and a couple of others that came out in 2019 and 2020. I'm not going to go into those too much today, but just to give you a flavor, this section here, this profile here is located where this black line is here on the map. And the colors here indicate P wave velocity. And to get your eye in, you can see this dome shape of the 1320 detachment right here. This star is the location of a hydrothermal vent system, which sits on top of the dome, which is this red star right here. And you can see the dome of the core complex has these relatively fast P wave velocities. And this is a pattern that's common in detachment faults we've seen elsewhere. So during that just short of 11-day period, we detected nearly 2,500 microearthquakes. As you might expect, magnitude of completion wasn't as low, but still down to around 0.7. And on the map on the right, you can see these little black dots are those events that we detected in 2016. And on top of that, you can see that the 2014 events are plotted in gray. And you can see there's this significant difference between the two experimental results just in that 2-year time difference. And I should say that we used the exact same velocity model and the same microearthquake location algorithms, both in terms of picking and location inversion for both of these experiments. And straight away, you can see that there's still this patch of lack of seismicity in between the 1320 and 1330 detachments. And now, rather than that kind of diffuse patch of events that I showed you before, we've now resolved that northern seismicity into these two quite nicely linear bands of microearthquakes that are oriented parallel and subparallel to the main axial volcanic ridge. Just dwelling on that for a moment, this band here, where my arrow is a bunch of earthquakes that are clearly cross-cutting right across the 1330 detachment, which is quite different to what we see at 1320. And if we look at those data in cross-section, I'm just going to walk you through this series of 4 cross-sections. So we're starting off here at this profile A to A prime over the 1330 detachment. So this little brown line shows that 1330 detachment. You can see there are these microearthquakes that are between 5 and 10 kilometers right below the dome of the 1330 detachment as part of this linear band of microearthquakes. And they're distinct from the vents that we see kind of closer to the axial volcanic ridge, which is marked by this red line right here. And so the combination of these events having a linear pattern in map view and being right underneath the 1330 detachment leads us to think that maybe this 1330 detachment is getting close to the end of its life and is being dissected by some kind of magmatic intrusion. And that would agree with that linear volcanic construct that I pointed out in that 3D view a few slides ago. If we march south to profile B prime, we're now going over the crest of the dome of the 1320 detachment. And plotted on here, the 2016 earthquake locations are in black and the 2014 events are in blue. And you can see there are some considerable differences. So in the 2016 events, we still see events that you could associate with that main faulting surface over here where my mouse is. We also see some additional seismicity over here in the east. And the main thing we don't see is evidence for this very intense band of compressional seismicity over here in the west in the footwall. And so there's just over this 2-year time period, we see a considerable change in the way that the footwall might be bending or compressing like we saw before. And this is the last of those east-west cross sections. So from C to C prime, we're now a little bit to the south of the 1320 detachment. And you can see this very well-defined dipping pattern of microearthquakes heading off to the west of the dome, which we think could either represent the fault surface, or even it could be some relationship between the fault surface, the main detachment fault surface that is, and volcanic activity associated with the AVR. Now, if we look at these events in a north-south cross-section, so from D to D prime, so from south to north, to get your eye in, the 1320 dome is right here where this brown line is, and the 13 is here where the second brown line is. Again, the black dots are the 2016 events, and the blue ones are those from 2014. You can see the 2016 events define this really interesting southward deeper dipping pattern of microearthquakes. And I'll be honest, we haven't really explained these yet. We're still working on these data. You can see that in between the 1320 and the 1330 detachments, there's this significant reduction in the amount of seismicity, which supports this discontinuous model for adjacent detachments not being connected in the subsurface. And then we see more seismicity to the north, which could be associated with either some remaining slip on that 1330 detachment or even magnetism in the AVR. I'm just going to touch a little bit on focal mechanisms. We didn't resolve that many first motion focal mechanisms, partly because we just didn't have as many events to work with, and the network geometry wasn't ideal. But we were able to resolve about 100 well-constrained first motion focal mechanisms. There isn't that same clear pattern of extension and compression that we saw in 2014. So I've just plotted a selection of those focal mechanisms here. So if you remember, I showed you we had this clear pattern of normal faulting in the east and reverse or mixed mode deformation in the west. And we just don't see that in 2016. We see a much more heterogeneous pattern of deformation. And so what that tells us is that whatever's going on here must be changing over relatively short timescales. And by short, I mean over the course of a couple of years. So that kind of leads us to this first conclusion that detachments are likely to be not connected in the subsurface. So this is a kind of a summary cartoon that we drew in a paper that just came out in geology. It's actually in this month's edition, if you're interested. And what we're seeing is that we have microearthquakes on the deep portion of these oceanic detachments, labeled D here, and they're typically in extension. We have microearthquakes going on potentially in the detachment footwall, marked by this beach ball B here, which maybe are due to footwall bending, but then maybe those are episodic, so they're not going on all the time. And then I've got this event marked, this focal mechanism marked C, which I've called infrequent larger events. And I'm going to come on to what we think is going on with those larger events next. So that also leads me to think about why, if you remember when we were talking about TAG at the beginning with Brian DeMartin's results, why is it we don't see any shallow microearthquakes? And so this is something that has been vexing us for a while, and Inga Gravemeyer and others wrote a very nice paper in 2019 addressing this issue. And this is a figure from their paper. And here we have plotted depth below seafloor versus full spreading rate. And each one of these bars is a microearthquake experiment on a slow spreading mid-ocean ridge. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but the thing I'd like to point out is that these bars, which I've put a green star on top of, are ones where we have good evidence for there being an oceanic detachment present. And you'll notice in each case, these bars do not extend to the surface. So in each case, we have a lack of microearthquakes in the shallow portion of these faults, which is kind of odd. And it's the same thing that we see in our 13 North data. This is that same cross-section that I showed you before, and you'll notice that there's this distinct lack of microearthquakes in the shallow portion of this fault system. And so that leads us to pose these two hypotheses, whether you've got some kind of weak aseismic slip, or whether this fault is locked over the timescale that we're making our observations. So this is some work that I did with Tim Craig in Leeds in 2017, and rather fortuitously, there was a magnitude 5.7 earthquake that was teleseismically detected in October of 2016, which is located by this blue dot right here. As we all know, earthquakes that are contained in things like global catalogs like the ISC catalog have a fairly poor location uncertainty, especially in remote locations like this. So this white cross shows the uncertainty estimate for this event. But we do know that it likely had a normal faulting mechanism and was considerably larger than any of those microearthquakes that I talked about from our earlier experiments. just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go too much into the details here, but we did some body wave modeling to try and understand the depth of that event to a greater degree. So the key result here is on this histogram, we have depth and the number of microearthquakes as a function of depth from our 2014 experiment. And this line with the little dots is the RMS misfit of our body wave model to that 2016 magnitude 5.7 event. And you can see that we obtain a best fit for a source located at around 5 kilometers below sea level, which is well outside or much shallower than the depth of the typical microearthquakes that we see. And these waveforms you see on the right are a comparison of our model in the blue, in the red and the blue, and a couple of example stations that recorded that 2016 event. And you can see we have this best fitting result if we put our source at a depth of around 5 kilometers. In our model, we were also able to vary the dip. And so this fan diagram here shows the misfit between model and data as a function of dip. So the blue colors are lower misfit, and you can see that we have an optimal solution where we have a dip of around 50 degrees. And if you compare that to the average dip of the focal mechanisms from our microearthquakes, which is shown by this little thin black line here, which have an average dip of around 70 degrees, there's this considerable difference between the microearthquakes and that 2016 teleseismic event. And so that led us to this idea that that shallow portion of the fault is more likely to be locked. And so this kind of rinky-dink cartoon shows we might have microearthquakes going on in the deeper portion of these faults, which is what we observe with our OBS experiments. And then the shallow portion of the fault, which is dipping at angles of say 40 to 50 degrees, you build up strain and build up stress, and which is released by these larger teleseismically detected events on much longer timescales. So I'll leave it there. We've seen that we have this well-resolved gap in microearthquakes between these two adjacent core complexes at 13 North, which favors this consecutive model of discontinuous faults along axis. We've seen these differences between repeat microearthquake experiments for the first time, which suggests that deformation going on in these systems is pretty time dependent. And we've also seen evidence that that shallow portion of the fault could be locked and stress is released in episodic large teleseismic events, large in my world being something between 5 and 6. And then lastly, we saw at the 1330 detachment, we might have evidence for it being dissected by this linear pattern of microearthquakes, which might be telling us something about what happens at the end of the life cycle of a detachment fault and what happens when that fault is abandoned. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Ross. It's really, really interesting talk. Okay, anybody has questions? You could either type in the chat or raise your hand. I have a question, Ross. So, oh, sorry, before me, Jim, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry, let me get my early morning camera going here.
Hi, good morning. Jim and Donna, hi.
Hi, Jim.
Morning, fabulous talk.
Yeah, Ross, you did even, yeah, you're up even earlier than me. So that was really fantastic, really amazing observations. I was really struck by the fact that your, at least your first year results for this region were really similar to Brian's in the context that deep sort of portion of the seismicity, you guys think about the fault surface as being on sort of one edge of it, but it really seems asymmetric relative to that, in that it seems to be in the footwall and you're not seeing very much in the hanging wall. And it's not obvious to me, maybe that's, yeah. So why is that? Do you guys understand like kind of the distribution of stresses within the system and why that would be really where you'd be triggering a lot of the events?
Yeah, let me go back, kind of just go back to a map view of that, of what you're talking about. Yeah, that'll do. Yeah, so you see all these earthquakes in the footwall over here, but then in the hanging wall we have that compression, but you don't see anything in the shallow portion. Is that your question?
No. Sorry. I guess what I'm picturing is you've got the fault coming down, and am I saying it right? Yeah, this stuff's in the foot. Yeah, this the deeper events are mainly in the footwall, right? And not
Correct.
not on this diagram, not further to the west in the hanging wall so much. And it felt like your experiment shows something similar. And I guess we always draw lots of faults in the hanging wall. So I guess I almost would have thought it would be the opposite. So
yeah, that's correct. It's kind of striking that we see the same, you see the same arcuate shape. You see very little going on in terms of extension in the hanging wall. Yeah, that's right. And then these events that you can see in this cross section, we really don't know what their mode of deformation was. And I know there's a couple of focal mechanisms here, but they're pretty poorly constrained, and I wouldn't hang my hat on them. And yeah, we don't really understand what's going on in the hanging wall.
interesting.
Okay, Jeff has a question in the chat. So regarding your last point, I wonder if this isn't some confusion between the conditions for earthquake nucleation versus for continued rupture. For the big earthquake, you saw a centroid that was shallow, but where did it nucleate? It's hard to get the conditions for frictional instability at conditions of a very low effective normal stress in the upper kilometer or two.
Yeah, that's a good point. We wrestled with that. So if we're talking about an event that's happening at like 2 kilometers below the seabed, and how do you generate those large a large event at that depth? And yeah, it could be that it initiated in that microearthquake generating zone and then ruptured to shallower depths. Was that your point?
Yeah, that's more or less what I'm asking. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like there's very few places on the planet where you see earthquakes that are nucleating, within a kilometer or two of where you have zero effective normal stress.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that.
So, I mean, I guess I don't actually see a big problem here.
But I guess it would mean that you'd have to have rupture that does make it to those shallow depths. But on average, I mean, we're only able to get the depth that we obtain is just an average of that rupture patch.
Yeah, right. This idea that earthquake rupture propagates into areas of stability or conditional instability, I mean, it seems pretty consistent with sort of everything we know about the dynamics of friction. So it's interesting because it does look like maybe that's what's happening, but I mean, I wonder if that's sort of a simple explanation. It's consistent with sort of physics of friction and your observations.
Yeah.
Ross, I have a question, actually, follow up on what Jeff has been asking here. So I wonder, in terms of that life cycle of core complex, when you go to the Southwest Indian Ridge, Mathilde's field already presented this consecutive, can I say that consecutive in your term as well? So the consecutive ocean complex, footwall and hanging wall, really well mapped and recently deciphered. So I wonder that, and then that one cycle there seems to be very short, around 0.3 million years or so, whereas your field here on the 13 North, you said 2 million years slipping. So have you had any thoughts on what controls this slipping duration? And then that may relate it to this nucleation, what the locking mechanism in that the area B seismicity? Yeah,
that's a really good point. So we see these differences in how these systems operate, whether depending on where you look, and that seems to depend something on the spreading rate. So the spreading rate in the Southwest Indian Ridge is considerably lower, and also the magma supply. So and when I say magma supply, that's like a very woolly term that describes either some combination of the total amount of melt that's available to the system, and also how that melt is plumbed and where it goes. And teasing those two apart is difficult. And so we're really kind of crying out for one of these microearthquake experiments in a setting that looks different to 13 North, where we can experiment with areas that either have slower spreading or lower rates of magma supply in places like the Southwest Indian Ridge. And then we can start to piece together what controls the time at which you abandon a detachment.
Yeah, well, let's do it. It's very interesting. Thank you, Ross. Anybody else has any more questions? If not, thank you so much, Ross, for great talk. We now have Tolu here. Hello, can you hear
Can you hear me?
Yes, great. Thank you.
Awesome. Sorry for the delay.
No problem. So Dr. Tolulope Olugboji is a professor at the University of Rochester. He will be presenting submarine imaging of oceanic plates, silencing the singing of sediments today. Take it away.
Thank you very much. And thanks for having me give my talk today. And like the title suggests, this is what I'll be talking about: the detection, or how we improve the detection of the bottom of oceanic plates using, in particular, submarine seismometers. Unlike imaging on land, imaging in the oceans is challenging, and a particular type of high frequency signal generated noise often contaminates the signal. And our goal in my group has been to investigate this problem, how we can model this sediment reverberation, and how we can correct for it. That's what we're calling the singing of sediments. Essentially, earthquake waves that are trapped in the water column or the sediment layer and lead to harmonic frequencies inside earthquake data. So if I say nothing today, or if I kind of get you distracted, that's the key. The key is we can identify the signature of sediment reverberations in submarine high frequency body waves. We can model it and we can correct for it. And by correcting for it, improve the detection of lithospheric conversions and in general, in fact, subsurface structure. So that's the goal. One of the science targets in our case is to understand the lithosphere, asthenosphere structure, see what seismic velocities can tell us about the state of the lithosphere. And over time, seismologists have identified a high velocity mantle lid. And across that high velocity mantle lid is a low velocity layer. Oftentimes we think that is the signature of the asthenosphere, but in particular, it is this observation of high velocity gradients. As we transition from high velocity lithosphere to low velocity interior, there is a gradient. And the question is, knowing what we know about how temperature leads to the strength of rocks or causes the strength of rocks, is there any other role for things like partial melt, water, or mechanisms like attenuation? Temperature gradients are not rapid. And so to explain sharp velocity gradients, we need to understand how to interpret seismic velocities in the context of other geophysical observations like electrical conductivity, helping us understand what causes transition from lithosphere to asthenosphere. So that's one of the motivations for trying to improve the detection of the bottom of oceanic plates. Here are two views of the bottom boundary of ocean plates from seismology. On the left, one might say that's a low resolution view, essentially a slice through the Pacific Ocean, from young oceans all the way to old oceans, looking down 0 to 300 kilometers. And the view from tomography or surface-based dispersion is not contradictory to our understanding of thermal evolution. At young oceans, you have low velocities. At old oceans, you have faster velocities. The transition is smooth, is gradational. It's kind of fits with what we think we know. But when we turn our attention to high resolution imaging, and this is a compilation by Kate Reichert and others, and there are different methodologies, but one might say all these observations, this constraint, come from high resolution view. So body wave imaging, SS bounce points, residual functions, what have you, we see more complexity. Each symbol represents the depth to a sharp converter, a sharp scatterer. And the question one might ask is, taking all these observations together, is the simple thermal model sufficient? Another question might be, how do we explain this high resolution scattered wave constraints in the context of this simple view of a thermally controlled lithosphere to asthenosphere transition? But the debates will continue. We'll try to understand and improve seismic images, but I wanted to just draw attention to how seismologists do detection, imaging of oceanic plates. On the left here, I've classified all these techniques as terrestrial seismic imaging methods. And on the right, submarine seismic imaging methods. Now, terrestrial, obviously, we are on a terrestrial planet, but terrestrial to do with land. The triangles there are the seismometers. The star is the earthquake. And what you're trying to do with this kind of approach is to image the lithosphere in between the earthquake and the seismometer. I point out that the seismometer is on land, and so you have better signals, more earthquakes, because of the nature of the observation. When you are in the oceans, however, you would hope that because you are in the oceans, you can get a better resolution laterally and in depth of the structure of the plate. And that is the ideal case. However, because of the nature of oceans and the duration of the experiments, the noise conditions in submarine environments lead to a more challenging observational problem. And that's what I wanted to focus in on for the rest of my talk today. What are the noise sources in submarine seismology? What is the history and the research that has been done in removing those noise sources? And the key you will learn is that we have focused very, very closely on long period noise and modeling, constraining, and eliminating long period noise, but not so much on short period high frequency noise. So part 2 and part 3 of my talk will be describing this noise source, showing its signature, and in the final part, silencing that noise signature. Okay, so let's begin. More noise sources in submarine seismology. Where did they come from? Obviously, because our seismometers are on the seafloor, they come from the coupling of the sensor and the subsurface with what is over it, the oceans, ocean waves, and things like that. So that's what makes marine seismology challenging from an observational perspective, in addition, obviously, to its other technical challenges. We all know it's expensive. You've got to retrofit your seismometers. That's me, putting aside, going on a cruise. Yeah, you got to drop them off of the side of the boat and recover. These technical challenges, but also observational challenges. The goal is to highlight these observational challenges. I like to say that, these observational challenges will remain with us. And so understanding those observational challenges and conducting research to improve seismic detection has impact in short-term seismic experiments like that highlighted here by Kawakatsu in the Pacific Array, experiments that take about 2 years.
Can anybody hear Tolu? I think it's a bit.
No.
Stand by.
Unfortunately, but slide's still working. Tolu,
that we will develop to improve detection will be definitely useful. Yeah.
Tolu?
Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes. So we have lost you.
Hello.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Can you still hear me?
Yes, we could. Can you?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. So we have lost you for last couple of minutes.
Wow, how many minutes?
Could you start from this slide?
From this slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that would be great. I think your video also stopped.
Yeah, I'm seeing that too. Maybe it was just catching up.
Yeah.
It seems to have not completely crashed. So sorry, everyone, we'll just hold tight here and, oh, I see some movement on the controls.
Hello.
Okay, we hear you. We're not seeing your video though.
Yeah, I can imagine. So let me stop my share and see what I can do.
Sure.
I apologize for the technical difficulties.
Okay.
I'll see in the next 4 or 5 minutes if I can resolve those technical difficulties.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. I mean, it was very smooth right up till that point. So so maybe, yeah, maybe should I try having you stop sharing?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm going to try to start my presentation on another computer. I think that computer has just kind of fried on me.
Oh,
So
okay.
it might take 4 to 5 minutes, but I can still hear you.
Okay.
So while I work on setting up my presentation, I don't know, somebody can just,
we
chat us
can
up.
do something really quick here for you while you do that.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Yeah, so so everyone, sorry about those technical difficulties, but if you haven't already, there is a short survey for the high resolution small source seismic SIG next week. Sorry, I'll start my video, so at least we got some more faces up here. And yeah, it just takes about 10 to 15 minutes to fill out, so you might not get through all of it before we're back online, but yeah, just go ahead and fill that out. It's okay if you've never used small source seismic before. So it's for everybody, and it's to try to understand what the community needs are for that capability. And those survey results will be discussed at the SIG. So I see a message just asking about information of where the recorded sessions will be posted. So if you haven't found them already, there's on every event page that we have for live sessions, there is a files tab. And if you click that files tab, there will be a recording. And the recordings take a little while to process through Zoom. I don't know if you've had that happen with a multi-hour Zoom before, but it takes a little while. So we try to get them up within 24 hours at the end of the session. So there should be some up there, unless we have any technical difficulties, which we've run into a couple, as we all do. So
Casey,
yeah.
I have joined with using another computer.
Yes.
This other computer is just having some issues. So let me see if I can share my screen.
Okay, great. Thanks for being so adaptable.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
gonna go ahead and.
Okay, let me see where I am. Can you all hear me? Well.
Yes. Yes.
Let me go back to where I was. So where did just give me a cue when I get to the slide where I lost you all. So did you hear that slide?
Yep. Yep.
You hear this slide?
Yes.
And this slide?
Yes.
Good, so let's start with this then. Okay. Yeah. Take two. So as I was saying, regardless of the experiments, saying that we've got new experiments coming online, a new vision of Earth scopes in the oceans, and a large collection of PI-driven Pacific area experiments and community experiments. All these experiments in the oceans will require us to understand the noise sources in the short period and constraining it. Understanding, constraining, and removing it will improve detection of the subsurface from lithosphere to mantle to core, especially high resolution measurements. So let's start. Let's start by looking at amplitude spectrum. Let's compare the amplitude spectrum in, again, what I call a terrestrial environment, and that's the picture of the installation for that terrestrial environment, with amplitude spectrum of a broadband ocean bottom seismometer. This is an example drawn from just the literature, and one from ocean islands. I'll give you some time to look at this. A lot of you know what I'm trying to draw your attention to here, but some of you might be new to this. Compare the amplitude spectrum, say for example, in the terrestrial with the ones in marine environments. So here, you see the primary microseism, the secondary microseism, surface waves are in this range here, body waves in that range. And if you go down into the short periods range, you see the cultural noise show up. However, just by looking at the differences, you see the unique challenges of doing seismology, seismic imaging in marine environments. A lot of us are aware of this. In the surface wave broadband meaning both ambient noise and earthquake surface waves, you will see very clearly a signature of tilt noise and compliance noise. Tilt or seismometer not leveled horizontally. Compliance, just the background coupling of currents, ocean waves, infragravity waves with the solid subsurface leading to high noise. And sometimes the noise on the horizontal leaks into the vertical. Researchers, scientists have studied this clearly before, and I think we've got a good handle of removing it. And this is an example drawn from these authors here, where the gray shaded seismogram is the seismogram with tilt and compliance noise in it, and the darker seismogram is after correction. How do you do the correction? You look for coherence between the vertical and the horizontals or the pressure. Horizontals for tilt noise, pressure for compliance noise. You compute the transfer function A, and then you just remove. I point out though that this type of noise is background noise. It's not signal generated in the sense of being generated by the earthquake. I also point out that oftentimes this noise is dependent on the environment. A shallow water column, more noise. A deeper water column, less noise. Okay, so that's the general picture for long period noise. However, pay attention now to the body wave band, right? Look at the spectra in that region that I've highlighted in blue. What you see, I often look at this spectrum, I have not really noticed this until we started looking at the problem, but what you see is the signature of signal generated noise. See the sawtooth pattern? These harmonic frequencies, especially clearly identified on the horizontals, is the signature of the singing because it's repeated harmonic frequencies, the singing of sediments. You've got an incoming wave. It is trapped in a waveguide, essentially a water column in most cases. In the case that I'll be discussing today, in also a thin, highly reverberated sediment layer. And it is delayed and multiply reflected. And because of this delay and multiple reflection, it shows up as these high frequency reverberations that oftentimes wipes out any other signal that you hope to detect, in particular lithospheric conversions. So in the rest of this talk, I'll describe how we model it, how we correct for it, and an application in a particular environment. So, this is the singing of sediments in one slide, more or less. You've got an incoming earthquake that's got the source, a signature, and the earth response convolved into it. You however, observe the marine on your seismograph's marine data. But what has happened is that the earth has modulated that earth response with this particular filter. This is what the singing filter looks like. And that singing filter is just a function of the reflection coefficient R and the two-way travel time tau for each leg in between multiple reverberations. And that's the expression that shows you how you get that from the time domain to the Fourier domain, frequency domain. And because this reflection coefficient is less than 1, it simplifies to this expression. So again, this is the singing effect. So that's it, the singing of sediments in one slide, more or less. This has been studied before by authors that I've identified here. And so it was well understood for water. There are researchers that are removing now this signature for water, but not so much for sediments. And that's what my PhD student, Evan, and I have been working on for a while, and we think we've got a good handle on it. So again, I highlight, you're trying to You observe on your receiver seismic records, 3-channel seismic records. Your goal is to constrain subsurface structure, Oceanic moho and the LAB, through some process of deconvolution. That's what receiver functions are. But you have to go through this sediment reverberation and the water reverberation. It turns out that regardless of which reverberation kind it is, it has the same self-similar form in the frequency domain. So if you've got waves trapped in the sediment layer, or like that, or even in the water column layer like that, they'll have the same essentially amplitude spectra. It looks like essentially a comb filter, and that's what we're calling the reverberation effect. The shape of that filter, how high the comb is, and the spacing of the comb is a function of the parameters, velocity, and thickness of the sediment layer or the water column. And the goal when you design an appropriate de-reverberation filter is that you design a cyclic notch filter that matches the reverberation effect and knocks it out. So essentially the peaks, the high amplitudes in the reverberation filter are matched by low amplitudes in the reverberation filter. So to silence the singing and sediments, design an appropriate filter and use it to remove the offending reverberations. This is an example of controlled experiments where we do that with synthetic velocity models. So for example, a velocity model one might see in the ocean, you've got a water layer, you've got a sediment layer, and you're trying to target the cross-mantle boundary, the moho, and the high velocity, low velocity interior, what we're calling seismic LAB. This is the receiver function response with the reverberation effect in it. So that's the original receiver function response. And to the right here is the receiver function response after applying the de-reverberation filter. Note again that this is the expression of the de-reverberation filter. You prescribe the appropriate reflection coefficient R0 and the two-way travel time, delta T. Here in the original response, I highlight what the signature of the reverberation looks like. Those are these doublets, these negative peaks that repeat. So very closely spaced, negative, 2 negatives, and then 2 positives, and on. They go on like that. I'm showing the receiver functions at a high frequency. If you were to low pass this receiver function, bring it into the frequency band, say for example, that one might have in real data, this reverberation oftentimes will overwhelm your receiver function. In some cases, as you can see here, will overlap with phases like the cross and the mantle phases that you're trying to interpret. When you apply the de-reverberation filter, you remove those reverberations and improve detection of subsurface conversions. And here's an application to real data. This is the no-melt experiment. This is the configuration of the array in red triangles there, south of Hawaii, in oceanic plate with approximate age about 70 million years. There's been a lot of surface wave studies done with this array. Excellent work, demonstrating the structure of lithosphere, asthenosphere, but very little work done with high body wave receiver function studies. This is what the seismogram might look like without any major filtering except for removing a very, very long period for gravity waves. Notice on the horizontals, which is blue and black, that I got this kind of beating pattern. Essentially, this is the constructive interference of these waves that are trapped in the waveguide, leading to essentially something that looks like a beating pattern. When you look at the spectra and the coherence, immediately you begin to see that singing behavior. Again, that sawtooth pattern, high frequencies, and the harmonic frequencies follow this equation that I've highlighted here. If you take this equation, you plot it in the vertical lines, vertical dashed lines, you can tune the values to match the peaks. In our case, actually, we do have a priori constraints on shear velocity and the thickness of sediments, but this lends better, more improved confidence in our estimates of the shear velocity structure and the thickness in the sediments. So again, this is the signature of high frequency signal generated noise. Compare that with, say, for example, low frequency tilt compliant noise, for example. In the case of a long period, the governing parameters are gravity and the water column depth. In the case here of sediment reverberations, or in case of water column reverberations, the governing parameters are the elastic structure of the waveguide. Okay, moving on. And this is maybe one of the last slides I'll show because I'm running out of time, where we apply this actual data. On the left, again, is original receive function response. Very difficult to identify phases that are converting from the MOHO, PMS, PPMS, PSMS, or even the lithosphere PLS. Coherence is very, very low, but when you apply the filter, improved detection of phases and the coherence of phases is improved. This is also borne out when you take the arrival times and you try to predict it with an appropriate velocity model to stack for the depth of the converted phases. That's again on the top here, no filter applied. On the bottom there, a filter has now been applied, improving the detection of the depth to the preferred layer that I'm trying to interpret. So this is the last slide I'll show here, just showing that with this approach, we can get good seismic velocity models, place better constraints on the depth of the transition from high velocity to low velocity interior, because we're pushing the receiver functions to high frequency, 1 hertz thereabouts. You can also place good constraints on the wavelength of the velocity gradients. And taking together seismic velocity and electrical conductivity for this particular region helps us discriminate between models for what causes this transition from a lithosphere to a asthenosphere. I'll end it there, maybe show one more slide. We are working on extending this to the Alaska experiment. This is an environment where water column changes drastically, sediment structure changes drastically. The preliminary analysis is borne out that the signature of the reverberation varies from station to station, and future work will involve building tuned filters that can do this across the array to improve imaging of the oceanic plate in the Pacific Ocean. Thank you, and I'll take questions.
Thank you very much, Tolu. Okay, this is a question time. We have a few minutes before this Zoom will be automatically shut down. So this is a great chance for you to ask questions to Tolu. Okay, I see one hand raised here. Sorry, I can't identify who that.
Oh, no, sorry. I think that was my applause, which I will just do right now because I'm unmuted now. Great talk and quick thinking on your toes to get onto the other computer.
Yeah.
I'm curious, I might have missed it. Sorry, there's a lot going on, but did you look at this in like a lake setting to see what kinds of reverberations could happen there? Like
no, not at all. The only place we've looked at is the no-melt experiment.
Okay.
And we're working now on the Alaska experiment. But again, the technique I'm sure will be applicable for anywhere you think you've got the signature of reverberations. Essentially, just look at the spectra and the coherence between the vertical and horizontals. If you see those high amplitude repeating patterns that follow some form governed by that harmonic equation, then you've got strong sediments. You can just look at the time series too. You can also tell, and you can apply this technique to remove.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, totally. That's a great talk, and a really, it looks like a really interesting approach that you're taking here. And hopefully, I hope you can still come to our poster session actually later today, because it'll be fun to talk to you about this stuff some more.
Yes, definitely.
My question here is the application you mentioned in the application for no-melt. You had the benefit of the active source work, for example, that went on there. It meant you had good constraints on the sediment thickness. How much work is it going to take as you go into this, or how much effort is it to just use this to actually figure out the sediment properties, as opposed to then going on and using it as a filter to look for the deeper structure? It seems that's obviously an interesting question in itself, but
yes. So my sense as we look at this problem is to have just data derived filter parameters to essentially to tune the filter based on empirical measurements. So just try to match, say for example, the harmonic frequencies, and that gives you secondary constraints in sediment structure. Actually, on land,
People are doing this to use just the spectra and the residual functions to constrain sediment properties. So it will be not just one or the other. It will be both and will place better constraint on sediment structure. But because the filter is not too sensitive to the reflection coefficient, except for the fact that you have high reflectivity, and only sensitivity to the delay time, you actually don't need to constrain all the parameters, right? You don't need to constrain both VS and HS. You only need to constrain them in a joint manner. So I envision that we can do some kind of grid search, Bayesian analysis, and that's what I'm calling the tuning. So essentially just dialing knobs in and seeing at what point you improve residual function quality. And that way you target lithospheric convergence. Now, obviously, somebody can turn that question over on its head and say, okay, no, I really am concerned about sediments. All I want to look at is sediments. And then you can also then try again dialing properties to look for sediment, to constrain sediment properties. But I will suggest that that should be done again with other joint constraints, like people have been doing for constraining the sediment compliance measurement, things like that, and do that in a joint inversion, within a joint inversion framework. But, you know, again, active areas of research is not like we've got the final word on this issue. I think, you know, it's an important problem to study, understand, and contribute to as we go into this new era of, you know, observatories in the blue ocean, 70% of our planet, right?
Thank you, Tolu. This discussion could be probably continued during your poster session too?
Yes, yes, most certainly.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much. So I think we are about time to end this part 2 session. Thank you so much for the 3 speakers, Harm, Tolu, and Ross, for your time and all your participation. So we'll see you soon at poster sessions later today. So have a nice evening. And have a nice day, and see you soon.